A couple months ago, I made this resin dagger from Solo Leveling, but then it came out in the anime and it looked nothing like the webtoon, so I thought I can do better. And do better I did, so here's how I made the Night Killer dagger from Solo Leveling that I sent to the voice actor of Jinnu. If you haven't seen my other tutorial, I go over there in depth how I make one out of foam, out of cardboard, and out of resin, but for this tutorial I'm going to primarily stick on how I personally made this exact version out of resin. So it came from making a foam mold, so I made the dagger out of foam first and carved it into what I wanted it to do. I then covered it in plaster dip so that it was completely smooth and, you know, a lot easier to deal with. This right here is where I originally made my silicone mold, however we're not doing that for this tutorial. Instead, for your base, you're going to want to do the entire handle and the bit on the end. However, in this tutorial, you will see me using the perfectly sanded version I'd gotten from my original foam mold. However, we will be, for your sake, pretending that it's all in one piece from the get-go so that you don't waste as much silicone as I did. But here is what I did to make the handle and the little moon on the end for my already half-ish resin blade. Once I had drawn out my paper template, I traced around it on PVC board. This stuff is very hard. It works really well for things like this. However, it is toxic when sanded and heated, so do make sure you use the proper respirator and mouth protection so that you're not inhaling any of this. To cut PVC board, I just use a sharp blade and go over the same part over and over and over again until I have cut through it. Based on the thickness of the PVC board I got, I'm going to have to glue two together. You can just use super glue for PVC board. I can then sculpt it with a sharp blade, or I can sand it by hand. But whatever it is you're doing, if you are doing this step, then please be very careful. PVC board sands like a dream, so I just went over it in a bunch of different sandpapers, working my way up to the finest grit that I had. The goal is to get our base that we are going to be making a silicone mold of as smooth as possible so that we have as least amount of sanding work to do every time we use it with a finished piece at the other side. Now that I had my resin blade bit and my little crescent moon on the end, I just need to work on the handle. The thing that I'd done, because I'd done it in separate parts, I need it to be very sturdy in this middle point here, or it's going to be very weak. So what I did was I just made Worbla strip down the middle, and then I just made more Worbla strips wrapping around it, in order to strengthen that and slowly build up the shape I wanted. Since I need the blade to lie as flat as possible in the mold, I made sure by pressing it against my table that it would be flat so that there was as least gap as possible underneath it, as we need like it to be as flat as possible to glue it down, if that makes sense. This is where if you were making it out of foam, it would have already been one long piece, but because I wasn't, it's done in 3 parts. But now it means we can move on to making a silicone mold of it. I promise you it is going to be much easier than you think it's going to be, and we're going to make it as cheaply as possible. Let's go. So just like my previous tutorial, you're going to want to start with a solid base and cover it in tape so that it's nice and smooth. You can wrap some cardboard in tape and then build up a house around it. There are multiple different ways to do this. I use cardboard and hot glue to seal the edges. Do I still have some leaks? Yes, I do, but you know what? It's fine. It does the job. Just try to be as thorough as possible on, filling in those cracks with hot glue. You are then going to want to secure your base dagger in that little house. You're going to want to just put some hot glue in there, stick it down, make sure it's really nice and stuck. Because of how I have sanded this, there will be some silicone leakage underneath, but it's worked before, so fingers crossed it works again. Now that we have somewhere for the silicone to go, let's mix it up. Make sure that you have a respirator, just in case the one you have got is toxic. Most packs will also come with some plastic gloves so that you can keep your skin safe while you are working with it. So go ahead and put those on. Covered in PPE? Good. Now make sure you're also in a well-ventilated area and let's go. Read your instructions on your silicone. It will come in 2 parts, part A and B. Most of the time, the ratio is going to be 1:1. What that means is you're going to want 1 part of A and 1 part of B, and they're going to be the same. If you see the ratio being something like 1:2, A to B, then it would be you need, for every 1 amount of A you put in, you need to double it and put the same amount of B in. But I promise you, most of the time it's going to be 1:1, which just means put the same amount of A in as you put the same amount of B in. The silicone I got here says to go via weight, so that's what I did. I got out my scales and I weighed the same amount of A as the same amount of B. However, do not pull a me here and make sure you do it in batches. If your cup is not big enough, I overfilled this a lot and it was a pain in the ass to stir and make sure that it was done nicely. What you're seeing here is the footage from the first mold I made, as I did not film me making the next mold. So the next mold I made that you will see is one that I did in 2 to 3 batches, and it worked out so much nicer. Once thoroughly mixed, slowly pour over your entire mold and make sure that you have enough space above the mold as well that it isn't going to be thin once you've peeled it off. You need to make sure that it is nice and thick. Make sure as well you are pouring slowly to avoid any air bubbles. Then go ahead and check on your creation every few minutes or so just to see if there's any leaks and patch them up if there are. I just kind of used different bunch of tapes. Some of them stuck, some of them didn't, but you know, luckily I didn't lose enough that it affected the final product, which is also why I suggest overfilling it, just so that you are covered if any leaks out. However long the instructions say to leave it, I always suggest leaving it for another day. Then go ahead and rip off the cardboard and then turn it upside down and peel off the bottom. Once it is upside down, you can separate the tape from the base and then just peel away the tape from the top. Take your time with this step, there is absolutely no rush. If your silicone is still sticky anywhere, it just means it wasn't mixed properly. Go ahead and give it a dusting of baby powder or some sort of powder like flour, and that should help it a lot. My silicone came with this little blade piece, and I'm going to use that to go around the edge and just tidy up the top of my mold. Lastly, carefully remove the dagger from the silicone mold. If you need to do a cut down the top or the bottom in order to do this, go ahead and do that. That's what I had to do to get it out, but remove it as carefully as you can. And you should have one beautiful silicone mold ready for resin. As with the silicone, it comes in two parts, part A and part B. You have the resin and the hardener. You're going to want to make sure you are also using PPE as well, and you've got disposable cups, the dyes you want to use, your gloves, some mixers, all of that lovely good stuff, but it is important that you do this in a well-ventilated area with gloves so that it does not touch your skin, and with a respirator so you do not inhale any of that bad stuff. On my measuring cups, I went and wrote an A and a B so I wouldn't get them confused in future. This just makes it easier for me and my autistic brain. Be sure you are also checking your ratios. Again, my one is 1:1 to part A and part B. I had an itch under my mask. Ignore whatever the hell I'm doing. Except this time it wasn't on weight, it was on measurements. So just go ahead and do that. You will not need anywhere near as much resin as you did silicone because we're obviously not trying to fill as big a surface area. Not only was I also doing it in batches, I was doing it in two separate colors, red and orange, so that I could even them out nicely. I just wanted, like a cheeky ombre. Go ahead and pour them very slowly into the mold and use a flame like a lighter, or you can even use a heat gun over the top afterwards very carefully to get rid of any air bubbles. It will bring them to the surface. The colours I used here were far too dark. These were for the original resin dagger that I did from the webcomic version. My second attempt was far too light, but by the third attempt I had it down. You'll have to forgive me because all the footage after this point did get corrupted. I basically sanded down the blade and base with a mouse sander and dremel and then did the rest by hand to get it as smooth as possible, and built up the guard out of the PVC board that I showed you earlier and then filled in all of the gaps with Worbla. The handle, I just cut strips of fabric and wrapped them in this knot once everything was painted, but as for the paints, that's something really fun I wanted to talk about. The one I settled on was actually holographic nail paint. It's the one you can see on the left here. I painted over what it was going to be on in Flexi-paint first. It can be anything so long as it stays tacky for a while, and then I just pressed the powder on it bit by bit, and it gave this gorgeous finish that looks spectacular in sunlight. For the black details on the blade, I just got the thinnest PVC board I could and cut out the design somewhat similar and glued it on after painting it. In order to get it the exact same design, I just put masking tape over it, drew over the areas I wanted, peeled that off, stuck it on the PVC board, and then just cut it out like that. Again, I'm sorry that footage got corrupted, but if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below and I will be happy to answer them. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and I will see you in a future tutorial. Bye! Oh, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you. Pays my bills!